Hi, this is documentary filmmaker John Ziegler. I run the website framingpaterno.com, and this is going to be a video commentary with some brand new information and also an attempt to put into context the entire timeline and the entire real story of the so-called Mike McQueary victim as well as Matt Sandusky. And I'm doing this because in just 2 days from this taping, Oprah Winfrey is going to be airing an interview on television with Matt Sandusky. And among the other things, many things that you're going to learn in this video, is you're going to learn the identity of who the boy in the shower, the so-called 10-year-old boy, even though he wasn't 10 years old at the time of the Mike McQueary episode, is. And of course, this is not new information for those who have paid close attention to this case, because this particular person has made themselves publicly known in their own name in letters to the editor in numerous newspapers. So there is no real outing here. It's just simply a statement of public knowledge. But I'm also going to explain how and why I know this to be the person who was in that infamous shower scene that Mike McQueary says that he saw back in 2001, even though back when he was first questioned about it in 2010, he said he thought it was 2002. So a lot of new information in this video and a timeline that you've never heard before. The real story of the so-called boy in the shower and how it relates to Matt Sandusky and why it is that I'm sure that Matt Sandusky is lying and will have lied to Oprah Winfrey, I'm sure in spectacular and probably hilarious fashion. So as we start this full story, we have to go back obviously to 2001, February 9th, 2001. We now know that that was the day, the night, that Mike McQueary allegedly saw Jerry Sandusky abusing what he thought was a 10 or 11-year-old boy in the shower. Of course, as I've mentioned, McQueary didn't remember that 10 years later being the date. He thought it was March 1st, 2002, and I've always felt that that was an extremely important mistake on his part. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what it was that Mike McQueary saw. Of course, by his own admission, it was mostly heard. That's one of the first misconceptions that people have. His testimony is mostly about what he heard. He heard slapping sounds and presumed that meant there was some sort of sexual activity going on. He was clearly upset enough about it to call his father and visit with his father and Dr. Dranoff that night. And then, of course, the next day he goes over to Joe Paterno's house, and I believe that there's a very good chance that Mike McQueary's father, realizing that the Kenny Jackson wide receiver coaching job was now open because it had opened up 2 days prior, saw this situation as a great opportunity for Mike to get some FaceTime with Joe Paterno, show Joe Paterno what a great Boy Scout he is by reporting Jerry having been engaged in inappropriate activity. And let's face it, it's inappropriate for a grown older man to be naked in the shower at night alone with a kid that you got such a bad glimpse of that you thought was 10 or 11 years old. It turns out that that boy was not 10 or 11. He was a month short of his 14th birthday. He was 2 years short of winning a varsity letter on his high school football team. All of which is important not because of some bizarre attempt on my part to claim that the kid was able to consent. No. I'm saying that the kid knew what sex was. He was strong enough to fight back. He would have known what was going on. Much, much more difficult to get away with such activity, if it really did happen, than under the scenario that Mike McQueary has claimed. And by the way, the prosecution went further to lie on McQueary's behalf, telling the judge and the grand jury that the boy was 8 to 10 years old. 8-year-old and 14-year-old are in two totally different worlds in a circumstance like this. I think anybody would understand that rationally. Now, we don't know what Mike McQueary told Joe Paterno. Joe Paterno, 10 years later, claimed that he thought, he wasn't sure, that it was of some sort of a sexual nature. There might have been fondling involved. Interestingly, the word fondling is not really consistent with what McQueary would later testify to. It is my belief that Joe didn't remember what Mike McQueary told him on February the 10th of 2001, 10 years later, as an 84-year-old man, for reasons that I'll get to in just a little bit. So 10 days later, finally, after Tim Curley, the athletic director, and Gary Schultz, who among other things is the head of the campus police, are brought into this process by Joe Paterno. 10 days later, Curley and Schultz interview Mike McQueary. Now, interestingly, this interview must have gone pretty well. At least circumstantially we know, because just a few days after that, Penn State puts out a press release because of a retiring equipment manager. And who is the only person other than Joe Paterno that they quote in that press release? I'm not making this up. It's Mike McQueary. Seems awfully odd that just a few days after Mike McQueary meets with the athletic director, that on March 1st of 2001, there's a press release from Penn State Athletics needlessly quoting Mike McQueary. And by the way, if you're going to make Mike McQueary part of a cover-up, awfully stupid, because now you're making Mike McQueary extremely vulnerable to a press call. Someone sees the press release, hey, I'm going to get further comment from Mike McQueary. And by the way, I mean, it wouldn't be that much of a stretch that someone might ask him about situations involving things going on the Penn State campus, and this could have easily come up. In other words, there was no cover-up, because they wouldn't have put Mike McQueary in that press release if they had just started to engage in a cover-up involving Mike McQueary as the only witness. So soon after McQueary talks to Curley and Schultz, and I think it's important, that 10-day period there, because in that 10 days, I think we all know that something can really upset us one day, and by 3 days later, we realize it wasn't that big of a deal. Of course, in this situation, no boy has come forward, no parent has come forward claiming that Sandusky assaulted their son or someone who they are the guardian of. So in that 10-day period, McQueary may have not felt nearly as agitated about it and may have given Curley and Schultz a very toned-down version of what he saw, which I believe he told Curley and Schultz, yeah, I saw Jerry in a shower horsing around with a kid who looked way too young. That's what I think happened. And by the way, I think that's probably what actually did occur. So because of that conversation, Tim Curley speaks to Jerry Sandusky. Now this is where I start to have information that you don't have, which ought to be very well known, but it isn't because of the nature of this case. When I asked Jerry about this, I got into great detail about, okay, what did you think that Tim Curley was calling to talk to you about when he said, come on in? Well, Jerry, got to remember, this is a month, actually a little more than a month and a half at this point, after Jerry loses out on the head coaching job at the University of Virginia at the very last second because Al Groh knows he's going to get fired from the New York Jets, and he's a Virginia alum, and he calls up and says, hold on, don't give the job to Sandusky, I need the job, and they hire him the next day after Jerry's second interview. So Jerry is still very much in the coaching game. Jerry says he thinks that Curley is contacting him because there's somebody interested in having him coach. And he actually tells Dottie Sandusky this before he goes into the meeting. I'm going to go see Tim. Well, Tim talks to him and says, hey, Jerry, we got a report from a witness. By the way, Tim doesn't even tell him. First of all, doesn't tell him that it's Mike McQueary. That's important. But even more amazing, Jerry has a very specific recollection of Tim saying that we have a male or female witness, which Jerry thought was kind of funny because it's obviously the men's locker room there. But Tim was so by the book that he didn't even tell Jerry if the witness was a male or a female who had seen him with a boy. Now, Jerry at first, at least according to him, doesn't remember what Tim is referring to. Got to remember, this is now at least 2 or 3 weeks after the event. So Jerry at first says he doesn't remember, but then he comes back to Tim and says, actually, I do know what you're talking about, and you can talk to the kid. Jerry then contacts that particular kid. His name is Alan Meyers. He contacts Alan Meyers and he says, hey, Penn State might want to talk to you about the fact that we were showering together several weeks ago. Are you okay with that? Alan tells Jerry he's not thrilled with it, but yeah, if they need to talk to me, they can talk to me. Penn State never contacts Alan, which might be about the only mistake I can see that Penn State really made in all of this, although I can understand why they didn't, because they decided to contact Jerry's boss, the Second Mile, and the Second Mile knew damn right well that it was Alan Meyers who was the boy in the shower that night, and they knew the relationship with Jerry and Alan, and that's part of the reason why they didn't freak out about this particular allegation or do anything dramatic to Jerry because of it. So it's also important to point out that Jerry tells Dottie Sandusky when he gets home from the meeting, or she remembers it this way, who knows exactly the timeline, but very contemporaneously, Jerry tells Dottie that Tim had asked him about a situation where Alan was a boy in the shower with him and that somebody had complained about it. Dottie remembers this. So if there's some sort of bizarre cover-up, Dottie's got to be part of it here. This, and by the way, this was not the cover story you would create if you were creating one, but Dottie would have to be lying through her teeth because she says she remembers very specifically that Jerry told her that Tim had asked him about an episode involving Alan in the shower. So we know that Jerry told Dottie contemporaneously that Alan Meyers was the boy. Now, Jerry gets asked by the Second Mile about this incident, and as I mentioned, they knew Alan Meyers. And Jerry is very confident that he told them that it was Alan, and that because it was Alan, they knew it was no big deal, because they knew that Alan and Jerry had a very close relationship. It was a father-son type of situation. And in fact, later that year, Alan would be one of the major speakers at the primary Second Mile event. There's a photograph of this, ironically sent to me by Ray Blehar on the morning of my first Today Show appearance, which I'll get to why that's ironic in just a little bit. But as I mentioned, importantly, Jerry Sandusky does not know that Mike McQueary was the witness. This is incredibly important for a number of reasons. And part of the reason why we know that Jerry is not lying about the fact that Mike McQueary, he didn't know Mike McQueary was the witness, is that there's not one shred of evidence that Jerry Sandusky tried to ingratiate himself with Mike McQueary. Now think about this logically, folks. If you're Jerry and you really did assault a boy in the shower, and according to Mike McQueary's testimony, this is part of the reason why it's important that Jerry did not know that McQueary was the witness, because it shows that McQuary's lying. Part of McQueary's testimony is that he made eye contact with Jerry and the boy. Well, if you make eye contact, if that's true, which I don't believe it is, you obviously know it's Mike McQueary. He's 6'4" with blazing red hair. There's no mistaking him. Well, Jerry didn't know. And part of the reason why we know he didn't know is because he didn't make any effort to ingratiate himself. And if he had assaulted a boy in the shower, think about this. He knows McQueary's the witness. McQueary is simply a graduate assistant because mysteriously, even though there's this alleged cover-up at Penn State which didn't happen, McQueary doesn't get the Kenny Jackson job, which he would eventually get 3 seasons later. So he's still a lowly graduate assistant. Jerry Sandusky was just offered the head football coaching job at the University of Virginia. Jerry has more than enough cachet to help Mike McQueary get a real job somewhere, if that's what Mike McQueary wants, or at the very least offer that up, or at the very least make it clear to Mike, hey, I can be helpful to you. There's no indication of that. In fact, if anything, it's the exact opposite. McQueary plays in 2 Jerry Sandusky golf tournaments that we're aware of, and I believe that there will be photographic evidence eventually revealed to prove that that's what happened. There are numerous people who remember that Jerry Sandusky, just as he told me, joked around physically with Mike McQueary at an Easter Seals football game where Jerry was one of the coaches and Mike was one of the players. Also, interestingly, Jerry says, and there's nothing to contradict this, and I believe him the way that he's told me the story, is that many years later, when Mike knows that Jerry is an assistant coach at Central Mountain High School, where Aaron Fisher went to school, where this whole story really ends up starting, or at least taking off, that because he's coaching high school football there, Mike asks Jerry about a walk-on at Penn State from Central Mountain High School, because Mike was in charge of the walk-ons at that time. Well, why would Mike McQueary do that? Not just because it required interaction with Jerry, but here's the really important thing. So Mike knows that the guy he now claims he saw assaulting a boy in the shower is coaching high school football players? And Mike's not only okay with that, he's inquiring about walk-ons from Central Mountain High School? That makes no sense whatsoever. Unless, of course, Mike didn't really see an assault or didn't think that he saw an assault at this time, which I'm very confident is in fact the case. Now, Jerry says he and Mike had a fine relationship for 9 or 10 years after that so-called episode. Again, he doesn't know Mike's the witness, so he's looking at this through very clear glasses. He's not looking at Mike in any sort of a jaundiced way. And then he says he noticed a cooling of the relationship in late 2010, early 2011. He says he remembers this way before. Obviously, he knows that Mike McQueary was the person who witnessed him in the shower. Well, why does that make sense? It makes perfect damn sense, because that's the time in which McQueary is approached by investigators, and it's at that moment that I believe Mike McQueary gets convinced by these investigators, with the use of Aaron Fisher, that Mike McQueary did in fact see an assault because Jerry is a pedophile. If Mike doesn't realize that Jerry is supposedly a pedophile, then he can go along living his life thinking, well, I just saw some weird horseplay in the shower. It was inappropriate, but it was no big deal. And, you know, Penn State took care of it. But then when he gets told in late 2010, under highly suspicious circumstances, in a situation where they basically, you know, have an enormous amount of leverage over Mike, at least psychologically, because Mike thinks that they've come to see him about penis pictures that he sent to a Penn State co-ed through a Penn State phone, and also he has this gambling issue in his background, so he's more than willing to tell them what they want. They convince him, with the use of Aaron Fisher, hey Mike, we've got this kid who says he's being forced to have sex with Jerry. Are you sure you didn't see something really bad back in 2001 or 2002, whatever it was? Well, it's perfectly natural under those circumstances for Mike to go, oh my gosh, wow, you know, I knew it was weird. I didn't realize it was that weird. That is horrendous. Yeah, I can help you out here. Mike probably even thinks that he's doing the right, he said constantly he was doing the right thing, or that he thought he was doing the right thing, because he's been convinced that Jerry's a pedophile. Well, this is a circular argument, because the basis for Jerry being a pedophile is that Mike McQueary allegedly saw him assaulting a kid in the shower. But Mike only believes that because he was told that Jerry's a pedophile. This is how this whole case works, folks. Now, meanwhile, while McQueary is going through this evolution, Alan Meyers and Jerry Sandusky remain incredibly close. Let me go through a series of things, and I've been able to verify every single one of these independently. A series of things that Alan Meyers does in his relationship with Jerry after this supposed assault episode. When he's a senior on his high school football team, Alan has Jerry stand in as his father on that senior night at West Branch High School. Jerry is the commencement speaker at Alan's request at Alan's high school graduation. Alan lives with the Sanduskys for 3 months while he's attending Penn State University. Alan invites Jerry and Dottie to his wedding, which is an exceedingly weird thing to do if, in fact, someone had sexually assaulted you in the past. A photo of Jerry and Alan in his Marine uniform is the photo that is used in the internet version of Jerry's resignation letter from the Second Mile. While he is in the Marines, Alan drives at least 10 hours by his own admission, as written in letters to the editor, to numerous Pennsylvania newspapers, and to the Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania. He drives 10 hours to attend the funeral of Jerry's mother. Now, I think anybody with any kind of common sense realizes that this goes way beyond this, I believe, overblown notion of compliant victimization. This is a relationship between somebody who didn't have a father figure and somebody who thought of himself as Alan's father. I mean, that's as clear as could possibly be. So in November of 2010, in the midst of this Jerry Sandusky grand jury investigation, prosecutors get an email from a person we now know to be a retired Baltimore policeman, this anonymous email, who has never spoken about this, which is awfully weird despite numerous media inquiries recently, that he tells them in an email that he had an internet chat with Mike McQueary's brother. Now, several people claim that they believe, these are people from the chat room, but I cannot prove this, but this is from several people, they claim that that conversation between the retired Baltimore police officer and Mike McQueary's brother occurred back in 2006. 2006, which is interesting from a timeline perspective. So it's not till November 2010 that this former cop gets wind of an investigation involving Jerry, and he says, hey, you might want to talk to Mike McQueary because he may have seen Jerry with a boy in a shower. Well, isn't it interesting that that story in the email is what I believe actually happened? Jerry was in a shower with a boy. I mean, chat rooms are famous or infamous for exaggerating stories. So, yet there's not one element of it to indicate that this story has been exaggerated once it gets to the police, which is amazing on a number of fronts. But there's not one shred of evidence from that email that there was an assault that took place. This was simply a situation where, hey, third hand, at least third hand, this former cop says, hey, you might want to talk to Mike McQueary. And as I've said, McQueary, when they make contact with him, is panicked. Don Van Atta from ESPN, I have the audio at our website proving this. ESPN censored this from his profile of Mike McQueary, but it's exceedingly obvious that McQueary thought the investigators had come to him not about Sandusky, which he testified to and lied about, clearly, but he thought it was about penis pictures that he had sent of himself through a Penn State phone to a Penn State co-ed, which would have ended his career. He knows this immediately. That's why he's panicked, because he works for Joe Paterno. There's not a chance in the world Paterno's going to put up with that kind of baloney. So it's not for 3 weeks after the initial contact, 3 weeks before McQueary, in his lawyer's office in a handwritten statement, finally claims that he saw some sort of a rape. By the way, it's the only time he ever said he saw some sort of a rape, and in fact, he would later claim he never said that, but in his written statement, it certainly is strongly implied that he did. The only thing really backing up Mike McQueary on this, of course, is Joe Paterno's testimony, which happens soon after this contact the investigators have with Mike McQueary, and he gives them this handwritten statement. Now, what's amazing about Paterno's testimony, among other things, is that it happens 3 weeks after a series of Outback Bowl appearances that were so bad on Joe Paterno's behalf, who was about to turn 84 years old, that at least one of those interviews that Joe Paterno tried to do went viral on the internet because it was frankly embarrassing. He had no idea what was going on. I've spoken to people at his Outback Bowl press conference who thought he had had a stroke. The reality is he was in very poor health at that time, and I don't believe there's any indication at all, nor would it have been reasonable, that he remembered exactly what Mike McQueary told him 10 years later from an incident where no one even got the year right in a 15-minute conversation on a Saturday morning in his kitchen. So I don't put a lot of stock in Joe Paterno's testimony, and I believe it's much more logical that Mike McQueary and or Scott Paterno, and I've gotten into great detail on this in the past, but I feel very strongly that the circumstantial evidence backs me up on this, that either Mike and or Scott misrefreshed Joe's recollection as to what Mike had told him 10 years prior. And I'll just leave that at that for right now, because I'm going to get sidetracked if I get too much into why that is, but I've done previous videos on why I believe that the evidence indicates that that's what happened. So now, after Joe Paterno's testimony comes the Sarah Ganim article of late March of 2011. This is when the story becomes public locally that Jerry Sandusky is being investigated. Well, at this point, this becomes very important in the search for the Mike McQueary victim, which we don't even know there is a Mike McQueary episode. And in fact, Jerry Sandusky is not even telling anybody in his own circle at this point that there's a Mike McQueary episode, which is further evidence that he didn't know that there was a Mike McQueary episode because he didn't know Mike was the witness and he didn't think of it as an episode. But at this point, Gary Gray, who's an important figure in this story, former Penn State football player, former Penn State coach, and a confidant of Jerry, he organizes a letter-writing campaign in support of Jerry in response to the revelations of the Sarah Ganim article. Now, Jerry asks Alan to write a letter for him. Now, again, it's important to point out, Jerry is telling Gary, as they're going through how to prepare for this grand jury investigation, about all sorts of potential situations that could come up. He never mentions Mike McQueary's name, and he never mentions Alan's name as a possible accuser. I think that's important from a couple of different perspectives. Well, Alan decides, okay, I'll write a letter on Jerry's behalf. And as I said, this letter to the editor is published in at least 2 Pennsylvania newspapers. You can see these letters to the editor on our webpage, framingpaterno.com. He also sends the same letter to the Attorney General at the time, not Linda Kelly. She hadn't been named Attorney General as of yet. And the letter is ironically, and this is a large part of why I'm doing this video now and combining with Matt Sandusky, is Listen to Matt. That's the title of the letter. Alan's message is listen to Matt, who is supporting Jerry Sandusky in very strong terms, that these accusers are not to be believed, and he goes into great detail about how Jerry's the greatest thing that ever happened to him, and he lists several of things that I've already told you about regarding their relationship. Now, one of the more incredible things, bizarre things that happened in this story is that later that summer of 2011, just a couple of months before Jerry gets arrested and the crap hits the fan, Bruce Hine, basically the founder and funder of the Second Mile, Jerry Sandusky, Ryan McCumbee, who would very soon be elected to the Penn State Board of Trustees, they all play golf. The 4th person in that foursome is Alan Meyers, and they do so at the Toff Trees Golf Resort. Now, this is bizarre on so many levels, but the reality is Bruce Hine was clearly trying to show support for Jerry in the midst of the Sarah Ganim article, taking him golfing publicly at Toff Trees, but he also knew of Alan as a Second Mile kid and had no inkling whatsoever that there'd ever been any kind of an assault on Alan. And of course, Alan was giving no indication that there'd ever been an assault, because Alan apparently was very thrilled to be playing golf at Toff Trees in this particular foursome. And then in September of that year, Alan gets a call from investigators. He calls Jerry back. Jerry calls him back as they exchange these messages. Now, this is incredibly important as well, because these 2 voicemail messages have been made public that Jerry left for Alan in September of that year. In those messages, Jerry says, yeah, go ahead. I think you ought to tell your story. We have nothing to hide, really. And then he ends the messages with the phrase, love ya. Now, it's so typical of this case and the media malpractice that these voicemail messages, when they were released after the trial by attorneys representing Alan, they were somehow an indication that Jerry, there's the pedophile telling a male who at this point was in his 20s that he loves him. Obviously, he's a pedophile. That's what the moronic media got out of those voicemail messages. When I heard those voicemail messages, my immediately thought is, wait a minute, hold on here. Who is Jerry telling Alan to come forward to? Who is he telling him to tell his story to? It's not a national story at this point. This is not Barbara Walters that is asking Alan to come forward and tell his story. It has to be someone from the prosecution, an investigator or a police officer or a member of the Office of the Attorney General, somebody like that. And why is Jerry telling him to come forward if in fact he's a victim? Well, I know this is it's not rocket science, folks. If anybody in the news media even used half a brain, they'd be able to figure it out for themselves. Well, as it turned out, I was 100% right. Alan was being asked by investigators to do an interview, and he did do an interview. And he told them Jerry never abused him, Jerry's the greatest thing that ever happened to him, and he would later say that he felt like investigators were trying to get him to lie about Jerry, and he finishes the interview in his own words by saying, you will never get me to say anything bad about Jerry Sandusky. This is 2 months before the story, or a little less than 2 months before the story becomes national. Now, to me, this is an incredibly important revelation, but to the rest of the, to the entire news media, that's, I guess, too much thinking required for them. Interestingly, Allen is not called in front of the grand jury. He does an interview, he's not called in front of the grand jury, so obviously that backs up his version of what he told the investigators, which was, Jerry never abused me. Now, we come to November of 2011. This is when the crap really hits the fan. November 5th, the story essentially breaks, and there are two words in the leaked grand jury presentment which cause a nuclear explosion. These two words, of course, are anal intercourse, which had no business being in the grand jury presentment. Interestingly, on the day after Joe Paterno gets fired, we now know from ESPN that Mike McQueary sends an email to the Office of the Attorney General complaining about those words being in the presentment, which is more than a day late and $1 short from McQueary's standpoint. But it's those two words that really dictate this entire case. Those two words are what got Graham Spanier fired. Those two words are what got Joe Paterno fired. It's what drove the media narrative. It's what prevented Jerry Sandusky from getting a fair trial. And of course, ironically, Jerry Sandusky was found not guilty on that particular charge when all was said and done, because there's no evidence that that actually happened at all. There's literally no evidence of it, and even that hanging jury said, well, wait a minute, we can't convict him on this particular count because there's no evidence that that occurred, because even the witness didn't say that that's what he saw or heard. And oh, by the way, we don't have a victim. We never heard from a victim in that case, which for some reason the media, maybe the most baffling fact of this entire case is that the media has found no interest in the reality that the most infamous case of child molestation in the history of America doesn't have a victim to testify for it. No interest in why that happened. Well, I'm telling you the real story of why that happened and why it destroys the entire media narrative. Now, on November 7th, we learn that Mike McQueary was the witness. See, originally we just knew it was a graduate assistant, but by November 7th, we know it's Mike McQueary. Now, this is important because it helps prove that Alan Meyers is in fact the boy. Because on November 8th, the very next day, Alan, unannounced, comes into Joe Amendola's office and says he was the boy in the shower that night, nothing happened, and he liked to tell his story. By the way, he came in with family members. Joe tells him come back the next day, because Joe had no idea this was going to happen, and obviously Joe's in the middle of a crap storm. So on November 9th, the day Joe Paterno would be fired, that particular night, Alan returns and gives a verbal statement to an FBI-trained investigator. That statement is on our website, framingpaterno.com. Now, the statement has its pros and cons, as you might expect. I mean, this is 10 years after the fact. Alan is obviously having his perceptions molded by an enormous amount of media coverage over the previous several days, and he gets a couple of things wrong, like, for instance, the date, which I find to be hilarious that there are some people who say that this destroys his credibility, even though he's using the date that Mike McQueary gave publicly. So, because the prosecution uses a date, and Mike McQueary uses a date, and that's what's being reported everywhere, and because Alan uses the same date, aha! He's the one who's not credible. Well, wait a minute. What about Mike McQueary, the Office of Attorney General? How come they don't lose their credibility over that? To me, it would actually be weirder if Alan had not agreed with the date, if he had somehow remembered the actual date. But you got to remember, this was not that big of a deal. The only things Alan remember are taking a shower, hearing a door slam, which is an incredibly important fact for his credibility, because there was no way to know that at that point yet. And he also says that he did not know that Mike McQueary was the person, and he doesn't know, he thinks he knows the year, but he also remembers that Jerry told him that Penn State was going to contact him shortly thereafter. Now, he gets the time frame wrong on how long it took for Jerry to say that, but that, to me, again, is more than understandable and would be weird if he knew exactly the amount of time, because it was probably closer to 3 weeks after the event than anything else, but that's not what he says in the statement. But to me, that's irrelevant. I mean, these are the types of inconsistencies or inaccuracies that are perfectly normal, and you would expect in a statement like this for an event that was not a big deal when it happened, and he's being asked about it 10 years later. The important parts of the statement are he's unequivocal. He says, I don't understand why Mike McQueary is saying this. Mike McQueary is wrong. Mike McQueary did not see an assault because Jerry never assaulted me then. He never assaulted me at any time. Alan says only one thing. He says, Jerry used to put his hand on my knee while we were driving. It made me a little uncomfortable. And then I think he says he never did it again. I'm not sure about that, but that's my recollection. But the point is, by the way, that's something that almost every accuser has said, because Jerry had the habit of doing that, for better or for worse. The reality is, the statement could not be more strong in its support of Jerry, more unequivocal that nothing happened that night, and more unequivocal that Mike McQueary is flat out wrong, and he's confused as to why McQueary's saying that. And he also tells the story about what happened the first time he got interviewed by the investigators and how he felt like they were trying to get him to lie about Jerry, which I think is important in the broader context here of what really happened. So Joe Amendola and his investigator think, my God, this statement is a game changer. We've broken the case. We're going to destroy McQueary's credibility. Until shortly thereafter, and I believe it was about 2 weeks later, Joe Amendola gets a letter from Andrew Shubin, one of the most important figures in this entire case, even though he's not well known publicly. He's an attorney in State College. Interestingly, he's a University of Pittsburgh grad, which I'm sure a lot of Penn Staters would love to know. And apparently he brags to people about being a Pitt grad while working in State College. So he writes a letter to Amendola and tells Amendola in person that he is representing Alan. At first, Joe thinks this is good because he thinks Alan needs representation for the crap storm. And then Andrew Shubin tells him, no, Alan was a victim. In fact, he was one of the worst victims in this case. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the message that Joe got. Joe was completely stunned, flummoxed, perplexed, didn't know what to do. And he decides at that point, well, I guess we can't rely on Alan. Now, it is both Joe and Jerry's belief at this point that Andrew Shubin was bluffing them about Alan. That Alan never actually claimed to be a victim. And that the most likely scenario here is that at worst, Alan gets convinced by Shubin and by the national news media that Jerry must really be a pedophile, that he must have been grooming Alan all this time. Alan didn't realize it, and that's why he goes along with being called a victim. Now, interestingly, Shubin had represented Alan Meyers in a DUI well before the story ever broke. In fact, he would end up representing him in 2 DUIs, which would cause Alan to lose his driver's license and potentially his job. He's no longer in the Marines at this point. And interestingly, Alan's mother worked for Andrew Shubin in his office. So there's obviously a very strong connection there, and it's hardly a leap that Andrew Shubin says to Alan, hey, tell me about your relationship with Jerry, because Shubin has been basically advertising for Sandusky victims at this point. That's what's amazing about all this. So that's what I believe happened. I think that's what the facts show happened. Now, during this time period, some interesting things occur. Sandusky tells Amendola that McQueary got the wrong date, the month, and the year. And it turns out, as has happened many times in this case, that he was right. And you may recall that Amendola tells Bob Costas of this statement that Alan had given to his office. Now, Alan is never called to testify in this case, ever, which is amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And I think Joe Amendola regrets not calling Alan Meyers. But you have to understand, in the situation that Joe Amendola was in, all he knows is he's being told that Alan is a victim now. He's got 800 million holes in the ship that he's got to plug. And I think that he just made an understandable mistake. I think he should have called Alan Meyers, because I don't think Alan Meyers ever would have testified that he was abused. And I know that Alan Meyers has never said that he was abused by Jerry Sandusky. And as I said, Jerry got acquitted, found not guilty on that worst particular charge in that episode. Now, interestingly, I talked to one of the jurors in the case, and this just shows you what a sham the trial was. One of the jurors was so close to the McQueary family, and this is a woman who told the court this, that she said to me she did not feel comfortable questioning his credibility. That's almost a direct quote. Now, Joe Amendola did not want her on the jury. Guess who wanted her on the jury? Jerry Sandusky, Mr. Naive guy, thinking that because, she had a connection to Penn State football that she would understand him better. not realizing that it was exactly the opposite, that anyone connected to Penn State football at all was going to be more hard on Jerry Sandusky. And I think it was that jury, I think that jury felt it was their civic responsibility to convict Jerry Sandusky, because after all, it was their community that was being accused of protecting a pedophile to protect football. So she stayed on the jury, and it's amazing to me that they even found Jerry not guilty on the McQueary rape charge because of that very phenomenon of which I speak. Now, after the trial, lawyers come forward representing Alan, saying they represent victim number 2, and they release those voicemail messages, which, again, for some reason, the news media doesn't even bother to ask, well, why didn't this person testify? I mean, that question has never even been asked, which is absolutely amazing. At this point, I interview Jerry Sandusky in prison, and I ask him who was victim 2, because at this point I didn't know who it was. And he does not tell me, but he gives details of his story. Now, it's important to point out that Jerry has no incentive at this point to make anyone believe that Alan is victim 2, because Alan is now saying he's a victim, or he's suing Penn State, or his attorneys are claiming that he is a victim. So there's no incentive for Jerry to create a cover story to have someone believe that Alan is victim 2. There's hundreds of other kids, if you wanted to create a cover story, who never claimed Jerry abused them, who were not suing Penn State, who he could have said, yep, that was the kid who was in the shower that night. But Jerry doesn't do that. He tells the story of Alan. He just doesn't tell me the name because he was told by the attorneys not to. So then I go to Gary Gray, the guy who was advising Jerry during the grand jury, to see if he'd ever heard of someone fitting the description that Jerry had given me. Well, he goes through his letters that he had gotten from supporters of Jerry for this letter writing campaign that he was doing, and he finds one from Alan, which fits the description 100%. I go and then verify. I even get to the point where I get the football roster for West Branch High School for the years in which Alan played football. Everything checked out 100%. So then I obtain the statement from Alan that he gave on the day that Joe Paterno was fired. As I said, it's on our website. I go on the Today Show. I waive the statement on the Today Show. I waive it on Piers Morgan that night. I don't get one media inquiry, not one media inquiry, about how it is that the boy in the shower is saying on the day Joe Paterno was fired that nothing ever happened. No interest. Now, part of it's because they're not interested in something that doesn't fit their narrative, but a large part of it also is because, thanks to Scott Paterno's ego, he had to put out a statement that morning before I even said anything, which completely made it impossible for anyone to have any political cover to even give me credibility. And Scott did that on purpose, because Scott is not about the truth here. Scott is about protecting Scott's own interests, which are not what people think his interests are. So that night, it was my intention when I went on CNN to reveal publicly Alan's identity, even though, as I said, and I must emphasize, his identity has been made public by his own actions, in his own name. He's written letters to the editor on this issue supporting Jerry. At that point, you have no right to anonymity. And I had gone through numerous conversations with experts to make sure that I was on solid ground here, including Jim Clemente. Jim Clemente, the sex crimes expert in the Paterno report, he had said that he understood, and I think I would say he was supportive of me going ahead and saying that Alan Meyers was the kid's name. Well, literally in the limo ride over to the Piers Morgan show, he changes his mind. And he calls me desperate to get me to not say Alan's name on television. And I said, well, why? He says, well, I've heard secondhand that Alan is very upset, blah, blah, blah. And I said, look, you put me in a really tough spot, but here's what I'll do as a favor to you, because I'm trying to be a nice guy. I won't say his name, but can I say Alan? I want to understand why it is he doesn't want his name mentioned when he was the one that wrote these letters to the editor. And I just want to know what happened. If he had changed his story, fine. If he was really abused, and I believe that, and he's credible with it, then I'm done. I'll give up this whole story. But until and unless that happens, I have to keep going with this. Jim actually agreed. and said he would try to help make that happen. Well, it turned out later, after I go on CNN, and by the way, the CNN appearance was absolutely harmed because I was uncertain of what the heck I was supposed to do there. My entire game plan had been changed at the last second. But then I later find out that Jim Clemente's story is complete BS. I don't know if he lied, if he knowingly lied, or just told me a story that achieved his objectives, but there was no contact from Alan. It was all a bunch of baloney. And frankly, that whole episode really turned me off to these child sex abuse experts and advocates. I strongly believe that a huge portion of this is a scam. Not that child sexual abuse is a scam. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there is a racket that is involved with this, and I got burned by the worst elements of that particular racket. So that was a clusterfuck, and I of course got blamed on TMZ and Deadspin for outing Alan's name, which is hilarious. I go to great lengths to protect his name. I'm trying to be the nice guy. We have a technical glitch, a computer attack, an attack on our computer, which, because I claimed at the beginning unknowingly that it was a hacking, now people claim I'm lying. I don't know the difference between an attack and a hack. All I know is that my computer's not working in a New York City hotel room where I haven't eaten all day, and I mistakenly allowed Alan's name to be in part of the story that we put out there. As soon as we were able to fix it, we fixed it. There's no record of it on the internet. And again, most importantly, he'd already put his own name out there in the newspapers. So this was the height of insanity, this entire situation. But of course, I'm the bad guy because they need me to be the bad guy, because they need to protect their narrative. So then the next major thing that happens is that victim 2, Alan, settles. And I told numerous members of the Board of Trustees at Penn State that this was a huge mistake to let the settlements happen with this kind of speed, and especially to let Alan, victim number 2, settle, because it was going to be our last chance for the truth. Anthony Lebrano I told this to, Barbara Duran, Adam Telefaro, they all said, yeah, I totally agree, and then they all caved. They all voted for it. They're all a bunch of cowards. And to me, this was probably our last shot to really know what the truth was in all this case, even though I think I know what the truth is, but to be able to prove it publicly. Because once the money is paid, now you've changed all the incentives and you've created an enormous amount of hurdles to getting to the truth. Now, interestingly, Matt Sandusky, this is where Matt Sandusky comes into this again. Matt Sandusky also settled with Penn State using the same lawyer, Andrew Shubin. What a coincidence. By the way, this is the same law firm which represented Matt Sandusky's wife in a brutal divorce proceeding. How bizarre is that? So he uses the same law firm that he hated his wife during the divorce, ex-wife during the divorce proceedings, and hated, according to Dottie, this particular attorney who works in the same law firm. But now, politics make strange bedfellows. Well, so does money. And Matt Sandusky is completely lying for reasons that I'll get to shortly. So we got Matt Sandusky and Alan, who were friends, knew each other. They are having the same lawyer. They both settle with Penn State. And, it's interesting because there's another important connection here with Alan and Matt. Jerry told me in my second interview with him in prison something very interesting. He says that he told Matt just before the trial that Alan had flipped and become an accuser or a victim. And Jerry now believes, in retrospect, naive Jerry, that this was the moment that Matt goes, uh-oh, wow. The light bulb goes off in Matt's mind. Number one, if Alan's now an accuser, we're losing. And if Alan's an accuser, that means I can be an accuser. Interestingly, that he went to the same attorney. And it's not soon after that right in the middle of the trial, Matt Sandusky comes home, says to the family, I could get up on the stand and lie just like victim number 4 did and make a lot of money. And then lo and behold, he does exactly that with a story that makes no sense, has no logical basis to it. and in a way that he's obviously and clearly lying. So the connection here between Alan and Matt is incredibly important. By the way, think about this logically again. If you're Jerry and you really did abuse Matt Sandusky, why in the world would you tell Matt Sandusky that Alan Meyers has flipped? Why would you tell him that if you abused him? I mean, you would have to be a complete imbecile to do that, or you'd have to have a death wish if you really abused Matt Sandusky. But he didn't really abuse Matt Sandusky. Matt Sandusky had been his biggest supporter, and he was confiding in what he thought wrongly was his biggest supporter, that, hey, by the way, we've got this problem. Alan has flipped on us. So after all this, I go on a long effort to try to track down Alan. I try everything. I try emails. I've sent him videos that I've made specifically for him to try to convince him to come forward and do the right thing, live up to his oath as a Marine. It's very clear to me this is a guy who has a conscience. He believes in the truth. I think he was manipulated by Andrew Shubin. I've tried Facebook messages. I've tried everything. He and his wife shut down their Facebook pages right after I contacted both of them. I have an investigator who has made contact with him twice. The second time, we strongly believe he confirmed his original statement to Joe Amendola saying nothing ever happened. We have that on tape, although it was probably done illegally. We have seen the insurance file that Alan filed in this case, for which he was paid $3 million. He only paid Andrew Shubin $700,000 of it, which is an incredibly low rate, which I think is consistent with the idea that Andrew Shubin told him, I'll cut you a rate here, you just go ahead and do this, I'll take care of everything, because Alan didn't want to do it. That's obviously just a theory, but it's consistent with everything else we know. See, because I think it's very clear that Shubin manipulated Alan into claiming he was a victim when Alan has never said he was a victim, and there's nothing in the insurance file to indicate that he said he was a victim. Nothing. I was always a little bit concerned that, well, maybe when he got the money, he told a totally different story to Penn State, and that this was, in fact, some sort of extreme case of victim compliance or something like that. Well, there's no indication of that. The insurance file has no statement from Alan Meyers. All it goes on are the convictions in the McQueary case, some media reports, and the assertion by Alan's attorney that he was the boy in the shower. That's it. Alan has never given any statement, any time, that he was a victim in this case. Ever. Zero. And now we know the ultimate proof of that, because if he had done so, it would be in the insurance file, but it's not. And by the way, I've spoken to the lawyer who handled the case for the insurance company, as well as the caseworker. They didn't even know that Alan had given a statement saying he was never abused. They knew nothing. And by the way, they didn't even care that they knew nothing, which completely, to me, blows apart whatever credibility these Penn State settlements allegedly had. These Penn State settlements are crap of the highest level. There was no real vetting. None. If you had the right lawyer, you got paid based upon what they told Penn State your story was. There was no real vetting of this whatsoever, because everyone just wanted it to go away. The insurance company, Penn State, everybody, there was nothing indicating any sort of critical thinking, critical questioning, or any kind of real vetting when it came to people who sought money from Penn State. And my biggest mistake in this whole deal is I should have very early on known that this was going to be the case and set up a fake claim to Penn State, because it would have been easy as heck to prove what a sham that entire process is. And by the way, I have more information that I'm not going to get into right now, that the entire Penn State process for settlement was a complete and total sham. But like I said, I'll save that for another day. Now, some people have desperately who want me to be wrong. In fact, they seem to want me to be wrong more than they want the truth to happen or be found, which I find bizarre and hilarious. Some people are trying to say, well, Ziegler doesn't have the right victim to. Which is really funny if you know all the facts of this case and you care about the truth. And my understanding is that Ray Blehar is now trying to claim that this is the case because he so desperately wants me to be wrong, more than, like I said, he cares about the truth. This is particularly interesting because I have numerous emails from Ray Blehar talking to me about Alan Meyers as victim number 2, It's very clear he believes Alan Meyers is victim number 2. Like I said, the morning of my first Today Show appearance, he sends me a photographic evidence of Alan speaking at a Second Mile event the very year of the Mike McQueary episode. I mean, it's been very obvious that up until, for political reasons, Ray decided he wanted to attack me, that he knew that Alan was victim number 2. And anybody with half a brain knows he's victim number 2 for a number of reasons. First of all, let's consider what would have to be the case for him not to be. Number 1, most importantly, the real victim of the most infamous case of child sex abuse in the history of this country would have had to have stayed silent and allowed somebody else to take $3 million while pretending to be him. And by the way, not only would that have to happen, which is preposterous on its face, but Jerry and Alan would have to know that that was what was going to happen, because otherwise it would blow up in their face if the real victim too came forward. So it's absurd right off the bat. It doesn't even get to first base on basic logic. But then consider what would have had to have happened for Sandusky and Alan to fake this cover story that he's victim to. First of all, Dottie Sandusky has to be blatantly lying that she was told contemporaneously that back in 2001 that it was Alan who was in the shower that night. Second of all, they create a cover story in maybe 24 hours, because you got to remember, it's November 7th when we find out McQueary is the witness. It's November 8th when Alan comes in unannounced to John Mandola's office. So in the middle of this crap storm, Jerry and Alan get together and concoct a cover story, which, by the way, isn't even the cover story you would concoct if you were trying to concoct one. But they concoct one with intricate details, including, by the way, the notion of the slamming of the locker door. But for some reason, both Jerry and Alan agree in this quick cover story. Let's say McQueary wasn't known to us as the witness. Now, how does that make any damn sense? That only makes sense if neither of them actually thought that McQueary was there, or neither of them knew McQueary was there, because they didn't. It's got to be true, because you wouldn't make that up in 24 hours. No one would say, because you wouldn't know at that point, well, maybe there's some other proof we don't know, that we did know that McQueary was, in fact, the witness. So you wouldn't even go there if in the midst of this crap storm you were trying to create a cover story. You would just accept, oh yeah, Mike McQueary was the witness, and we'll accept that as the reality. Well, they don't, because they didn't know Mike McQueary was the witness, and Jerry's actions are 1,000% consistent with the fact that they didn't know that Mike McQueary was the witness. So there is absolutely no doubt in my mind, I mean zero, that Alan has to be victim number 2, because the alternative scenario is impossible. By the way, if in some bizarro world that was the case, at the very least it completely destroys the credibility of the Penn State settlements, because he got paid $3 million. So why is it that Penn State is deemed credible by the news media on these settlements, except when it comes to having paid Alan Meyers? I mean, this whole case is just so insane. So what really happened here? It's Occam's razor. It's really not that complicated. You just have to think for yourself, and you have to know the facts. And the reality is this, that Alan Meyers was not abused. There was no assault that night. Alan got convinced by the media and by Andrew Shubin that he was abused or groomed in some way, shape, or form. He never said that he was abused. By the way, there's this story of him not being called to testify because prosecutors weren't sure it was him, because he didn't draw a good diagram of the last shower which to me I find to be hilarious, because if they had liked his story, they would have thought that the diagram was just fine, but they didn't like his story because he never told them that he was abused, and only said he wasn't abused, which is, by the way, also consistent with something that happened in the preliminary hearing when one of the investigators gets asked by Graham Spanier's attorney, do you know the identity of victim 2? And the guy almost has a meltdown on the stand, doesn't know what to do, looks over at the office of the Attorney General. They object vehemently. I mean, this was 1,000% consistent with a group of people who are terrified of the real victim 2's identity, becoming known because he doesn't and has never claimed he was victimized. He was never abused, and certainly not the night Mike McQueary said that he was. So Alan has somehow figured out, this can only happen by accident, the most amazing deal of all time. He was never sexually abused. He never said he was sexually abused, so he doesn't have to lie. He didn't testify, so he didn't have to perjure himself. Yet he somehow ends up getting paid $3 million with a small attorney's fee, relatively small attorney's fee, so that he lives in a nice big house now outside of State College, Pennsylvania. And he doesn't have an enormous amount of guilt because he probably still feels at some level, well, everybody knows Jerry was a pedophile, so even if I wasn't abused, then I did the right thing, or I didn't prevent a wrong from happening because he's a pedophile and he's where he belonged. Well, Alan's buying that because that's what his attorney, who got him a lot of money, is telling him, and plus that's what the media is telling him. My guess is that Alan's conscience knows what's really the case, and my investigator believes that his conscience is eating him up and that eventually Alan is going to crack here. I don't know. It depends on how much pressure is put on Alan to tell the truth, but I've done just about everything I can to try to get him to come forward and tell the real story here. Matt's deal might be even more amazing than Alan's deal. He gets paid money from Penn State even though he perjured himself, even though his allegation had nothing to do with Penn State. At least Alan was in a shower with Jerry Sandusky on Penn State's campus, and Penn State was told about it. Penn State had no knowledge of anything that happened to Matt Sandusky because nothing did happen to Matt Sandusky. He perjures himself and he gets paid all this money, and it's absolutely insane that Matt Sandusky is getting away with this, and he's a hero. Even though if it had really happened, which it didn't, had he come forward, he could have prevented all this other abuse. But he didn't. Instead, he asked Jerry and Dottie to adopt him well after the abuse allegedly happened. More amazingly, after Jerry is arrested, he goes into court to keep his ex-wife from preventing his children from seeing Jerry, the pedophile, the guy who abused him, which to me is the smoking gun that Matt is lying. He testifies in the grand jury that he was never abused, that he doesn't believe the other accusers. I mean, it is as obvious as it could be that Matt Sandusky is lying, and that whatever he's going to tell Oprah is going to be a load of crap, and I'm sure Oprah and the rest of the media is going to lap it up because it fits their narrative, a narrative for which there is almost no actual evidence. Matt is a sociopath. His therapist said to Dottie and Jerry, he has no conscience. No conscience. He's an exceedingly good liar. That's how he's been able to fool people. Well, he's no hero in this case. He is the most blatant liar in the entire case. And by the fact that he's lying, it blows apart the notion that accusers don't lie. It blows apart the credibility of the Penn State settlements because they paid him money he didn't deserve. And it also blows apart the media's credibility. Because here's the media buying hook, line, and sinker into a story that is clearly and obviously 100% balderdash. And that's why I wish that everybody knew the real Matt Sandusky story, because they would know what really happened here is vastly different than what we were told. You know, the unnoticed reality of this case, and I think Matt and Alan kind of proved this in a way. I've thought a lot about this. I think that the essence of what occurred in this case, and it's an exceedingly complicated case, but the essence is this. Time and kids changed on Jerry Sandusky. Time and kids passed Jerry Sandusky by. He never comprehended in his mind that guys like Matt Sandusky and Alan Meyers could do to him what they did. It just was completely outside his realm of experience, from a different generation, and he clearly did some things that were very stupid. I believe they were arrogant based upon his own confidence in his own goodness, that he knew he was doing nothing wrong. He was treated differently because he was a bit of a celebrity, and I think it created a situation that was a perfect storm. But for Matt Sandusky and Alan Meyers to do what they have done to Jerry and Dottie, after what Jerry and Dottie did for both of them, is one of the most amazing stories of betrayal I've ever even heard of. And I am positive that what they're telling you and Oprah and the public and the media is not the truth. And that's the real truth of this case. And for more of the real truth in this case, I hope you'll stay tuned to www.framingpaterno.com.